Hello, friends. Happy Friday from me, your associate pastor, and everyone at the Congregational Church of Amherst. Here we are in another week of social distancing of COVID-19. And even though our governor is loosening some of the rules and allowing some of our public spaces to open up, we still have the weight of this pandemic hanging over us. So I wanted to talk to you about something that might sound a little bit dramatic this week, but bear with me. I think it could be really helpful. So many of you may know that I spent a year training to be a chaplain at a Trauma One hospital in North Carolina before I came to be your associate pastor here in Amherst. Trauma One hospitals are great places to learn how to be chaplains because the patients come from all over and you see so many different kinds of health situations and crises. And they are mostly teaching and research hospitals. So often they are leaders in new insights for trauma and community health and recovery. And I just loved being there. It was great. And part of my job was to be part of the trauma team, actually, that gathered to assess patients when they came into the trauma bay, one of the 3 trauma bays they had on site. We saw all sorts of patients in those bays, people who had been in car accidents or motorcycle accidents, folks who had been shot or fallen off of roofs even, any sort of serious trauma you could imagine we saw at UNC hospitals in Chapel Hill. And they would arrive either by ambulance or helicopter. UNC was the real deal. It was pretty intense. And if you've ever been in a trauma bay, and I hope you haven't, you'll know that they're pretty small, right? It's a tight space, just big enough for the essential personnel. So it was actually so small that in our ED, we had a little map on the wall of where everyone was allowed to stand, believe it or not. So there's a spot for the lead trauma surgeon, the head nurse, the 3 or 4 other doctors that were on the support team. Usually they were residents. There was a spot for the person who gets the medication or the blood. And believe it or not, there was a circle on that map for the chaplain. And you might have the same question I had when I first started out, which is, why does the chaplain, of all people, get a designated spot in the trauma bay? Right? There's so much going on. It's just a crazy environment. And you might think, like I thought in the beginning, that it's kind of silly for someone who is more spiritually bent to be kind of in the center of that drama, that kind of emergency sort of crisis. Well, I'll tell you what I found out, which is that research shows us that traumas are attacks on the mind and the spirit as well as on the body. And so the mind does all these mental gymnastics trying to understand what's going on and protect us all the time. Normally, in typical non-traumatic situations, the brain processes things like this, right? It will observe what's going on, it will input the information and interpret that info, it will process it, it will evaluate all of the options and the feelings that are going on, and then it will make a plan, and then it will enact that plan, right? And this happens all the time, like when you're trying to decide what you want for lunch, or who goes first at a 4-way stop, or anything like that. But when the brain is facing a traumatic event, this process can get stunted. The brain will observe, interpret, and then react, like fight, flight, or freeze, that sort of reaction process. And those actions are not kind of this sort of slow, thoughtful process that we are used to. They're designed to keep you safe and to be able to respond really quickly. So basically, when the brain is attacked in traumatic events, it's not fully able to assimilate or process the event. And this can lead to various responses kind of after you're out of the traumatic event, like psychological numbing or shutting down of our normal emotional responses. And this is actually one of the things that causes PTSD, or the inability to assimilate the traumatic event emotionally and spiritually into the life of your story. And when we can't assimilate a traumatic story, we can get stuck. We can get really stuck. First, we're unable to reassure ourselves that we're safe because the brain is still kind of experiencing these stress hormones. Second, if our brains can't connect the experience with the feelings about the experience, it will just keep telling the story of the experience over and over to us. We can get stuck into this cycle. So you'll hear people say, I was driving and this car just came out of nowhere. It came out of nowhere. I couldn't have stopped in time. I didn't see it coming. And people will say these things over and over again, like the car just came out of nowhere. And then third, it will stay with the story because it's craving integration. So your brain will kind of clamp onto the story, and it can be really hard to move on in a healthy way. And so this is where the chaplain comes in, right? So many times when possible, it's not always possible, like sometimes the patients aren't talking, or they have to be kind of rushed really quickly, or it's really unsafe to touch them because they're so, fragile in that moment. That's a lot of the situations. But when it was possible, I, as the chaplain, there's like a little window between when the ED team is done assessing the patient and before they go off to scans, where you can kind of come in and, hold their hand or touch their shoulder and say something like, you're at UNC Hospitals, I'm Kate, I'm part of your care team while you're here, and you are safe now. And then I'd say something like, tell me what happened. And when they got to the part about the car coming out of nowhere, I'd say, how did that feel? And, sometimes they'd say something like, it just came out of nowhere, and that's not a feeling, right? So how did it feel? It was so scary. They might say, I was terrified, I was confused, the feelings kind of matching with the experience. And then I'd say, can I call someone to let them know that you're here, that they can come be with you? And these are the 3 steps of caring for someone using trauma theory, believe it or not. First, remind them that they are safe. And safety can mean all sorts of things. Physical safety is just one. You want to cultivate emotional, social, and moral safety as well. 2, help them connect the experience with the feelings of the experience. And this will help their brains assimilate the experience into the narrative of their lives. And 3, connect them to something life-giving and meaningful. In the trauma bay, this usually meant calling a loved one, but in other parts of life, it can be going on a walk or painting a picture or eating a really healthy meal, whatever kind of restores your soul. And I share all of this with you because, believe it or not, we are all going through a traumatic experience right now during this COVID-19 crisis. Traumatic stress results from an event or series of events or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting effects on the way we function in the world and our physical, mental, emotional, social, or spiritual well-being. So that's kind of a definition that I've found in my research. Trauma, physical, emotional, psychological, or spiritual injury in response to a distressing or life-threatening event like an accident, abuse, or violence, or natural disaster, can all play into our emotional beings, especially now. So no, this experience is not like a car crash or physical abuse, right? I'm not saying that. But it is a shock to our whole systems and the world, right? And so if it might be helpful, I invite you to lean on this trauma theory that I'm sharing with you today. Lean on this trauma-centered care to care for yourselves and maybe for your loved ones during this time. Remind yourself that you're safe and loved. Try to articulate the feelings that you're having throughout this experience with tenderness for yourself. And then do something that gives you hope and purpose. So that's all that I have for you today, friends. I love you and I'm thinking about you during this time. Please reach out to myself if you'd like to talk, or Pastor Maureen. We're always available to help you process and work with you. Have a great weekend, and God bless.